When the Titanic went down, her owners were made whole in 30 days. £1 million. That was the insured value of the hull, and Lloyd's of London paid it in full, in cash, before the inquiries had even finished seating their witnesses. 30 days. A ship worth more than most towns, gone to the bottom of the North Atlantic, and on the ledger, it closed clean. The people were harder to settle. 1,500 of them died in that water. Their families came with lawyers, and between them they asked for $16 million. They were offered $664,000, and it took 3.5 years to force even that. Sit with those two numbers, because everything about the Titanic lives in the space between them. The ship was insured to the pound. The people on her were priced by negotiation. One was an asset with a known value. The others were a liability to be managed down. That gap is not a tragedy of the iceberg. The iceberg was an accident. The gap was a design worked out in boardrooms and underwriting offices years before anyone bought a ticket. So tonight we're not going to ask how the Titanic sank. We're going to ask a colder question, the one the movies never touch. Who paid for her? And who was still paying long after she was gone? Here's the thing. Almost everyone gets backwards about the Titanic. We remember her as a luxury liner, a floating palace that happened to make money on the side. That is exactly the wrong way round. The Titanic was a piece of heavy industrial capital that happened to be beautiful. She cost roughly $7.5 million to build about £1.5 million, a figure her own managing director read out under oath after the disaster. For that money, in 1912, you could have built yourself a small navy. Nobody spends that to sell champagne on the North Atlantic. You spend it because a ship like this is a machine for moving money across an ocean, and the beauty is just the paint on the machine. The grand staircase was never the point. The grand staircase was the sales brochure. So here is the promise for the next 20 minutes. We are going to follow the money, all of it. Where the $1.5 million actually came from, and the man in New York who really signed for it. What it bought in a Belfast shipyard, and who bled for it there before the ship ever touched salt water. How a company planned to earn it all back, not in one glorious crossing, but in a decade of dull ones. And who was standing underneath the entire structure, quietly holding the risk, on the night it fell. And by the end, you'll have a single sentence that explains the whole ship. Because the suites everyone remembers were never where the money lived. The suites were the advertisement. The crossing was the business. Hold on to that line. We're going to earn it, and then we're going to come back to it. Start with the obvious answer, and watch it come apart in your hands. Who paid for the Titanic? The White Star Line. That's the name on the funnel, the name in the newspaper, the name on the brochure. Except the White Star Line didn't really own itself. 10 years before the Titanic sailed, in December of 1902, the company was quietly bought for an enormous sum by an American holding company called the International Mercantile Marine. And the International Mercantile Marine was the creation of one man, the banker John Pierpont Morgan. The price for White Star alone ran to something like $120 million, paid out in the shares of Morgan's new trust. Read that again, because it rearranges the whole picture. The most British ship ever built, Belfast steel, Southampton departure. The Royal Mail painted on her side was, on paper, a subsidiary asset of a New Jersey holding company, controlled out of Wall Street. Morgan was not buying ocean liners because he loved the sea. He was doing to the Atlantic exactly what he had already done to American steel and American railroads. Buy up the competitors, fold them into one giant combine, and stop them from bleeding each other to death in a price war. On the North Atlantic in 1900, half a dozen shipping lines were locked in a fare-cutting fight that was good for passengers and poison for profits. Morgan's answer was the answer of the age. If competition is destroying the margin, buy the competition. The Titanic wasn't a romance. She was a position in a portfolio. And that single fact changes the question we're allowed to ask. When you own one ship, you care about one voyage. When you own a trust with dozens of ships, you don't care about any single crossing at all. You care about the system, whether the whole fleet, year after year, throws off more cash than it swallows. So forget who built the Titanic. The men in Belfast built her, and we'll get to what that cost. The real question is quieter and much harder. Who kept the system fed? Who paid, every single week, to keep a machine like this alive and moving on the water? That's where the money truly lived. And to find it, we have to go to the shipyard first, because before this ship earned a single shilling, she had already cost a great deal more than money. Harland and Wolff, Belfast. At the peak of the work, the yard employed around 15,000 men. That's not a headline statistic. That's a town's worth of human beings, walking through the gates before 6 in the morning to the sound of a whistle, into a 60-hour week that ate their Saturdays whole. The pay was, for a skilled man, on average around £2 a day. And it stopped the instant you were late, or broke one of the company's rules, or damaged the firm's property. The ship did not wait for you. You waited for the ship. Now here is a cost that never makes it onto any balance sheet. During the construction of the Titanic alone, the yard logged 254 reported accidents. 8 men died building her. 8. Before she ever touched the water, before a single passenger climbed the gangway, the Titanic had already killed 8 people. We don't know most of their names, the way we know the millionaires' names. They fell from the staging. They were crushed. They were caught by machinery that did not care whose father or whose son they were. That is not a figure of speech. That is the first installment on the price of this ship, paid in Belfast, in flesh, and entered in the accounts as nothing but the word labor. The money side of that yard is its own kind of clever, and you have to admire it before you resent it. Harland and Wolff did not build the Olympic-class ships for a fixed price. They built them on what's called a cost-plus contract. The 2 sister ships were agreed at around £3 million, plus extras, plus the builder's usual fee of 5% on top. Sit with what an arrangement like that actually does. The builder cannot lose. Every extra ton of steel, every hour of overtime, every last-minute luxury the White Star men demanded, the shipyard simply added it up, tacked on its 5%, and handed the bill to the owner. The risk of the thing running over budget did not sit with the people building it. It sat entirely with the people who had borrowed to pay for it. And it did run over. Some of the ship's original grander touches, extra fittings and features, were quietly cut back as the numbers climbed, because on a cost-plus job, the only person watching the budget is the man receiving the invoice. Which points us straight back at the central question. The steel, the engines, the wages, the builder's 5%, the funerals for 8 men, all of it flowed out of that yard toward one problem. The problem every capital asset in history has to answer. How does anyone ever get this much money back? Follow one ticket. And not the famous one, the cheapest one, £7. That's what a third-class passage on the Titanic could cost, about $35 in the money of the day. For comparison, a first-class suite at the top end ran as high as £870, more than 100 times the price of the cheap berth. And when you hear numbers like that, your instinct is immediate and confident. Obviously, the rich paid for the ship. The suites are where the money is. Now look at the actual boat. On her maiden voyage, the Titanic carried around 324 passengers in first class, 284 in second, and 709 in third. The cheapest deck was the most crowded deck, and it wasn't close. That is not an accident of who happened to book. That is the business model, standing in the open where nobody thinks to look. Because in 1912, the North Atlantic had one enormous, relentless, once-in-history current of human beings flowing across it. Emigration. Europe to America. One direction. Mostly one way. In the peak years, well over 1 million people a year came through Ellis Island alone. 1907 saw something like 1.25 million in a single year, and the overwhelming majority of them crossed the only way they could afford to, steerage. Third class. The bottom of the ship. So here is the drumbeat again, and now you can finally hear what it means. The suites were the advertisement. The crossing was the business. The famous first-class names, the Astors, the Guggenheims, the Wideners, they were the photograph on the front of the brochure, the reason the newspapers sent reporters to the pier. But the steady, grinding, utterly reliable money came from filling 700 bunks every single crossing with people who owned almost nothing and were spending very nearly all of it on a one-way ticket toward a better life. The rich bought a story, the poor bought a passage, and the passage is what paid the bills. Then there is the check that almost no one ever thinks about. Look again at the ship's own name, RMS Titanic, Royal Mail Steamer. She held a British government mail contract, and on that voyage she was carrying over 3,000 bags of it. The government paid the White Star Line to move the mail on a fixed, reliable schedule, and that payment arrived whether the passenger decks were packed or half empty. It was prestige, and it was more than prestige. It was a floor under the revenue. The single most dependable income on the ship came not from any passenger at all, but from a contract with the post office. Now stack it all together, and the machine finally comes into focus. A guaranteed government check underneath everything. A vast, dependable flood of emigrants filling the cheap decks in the middle. And a thin, glittering skin of the very rich across the top. paying enormous sums for the privilege and paying, without ever knowing it, for the marketing that sold the cheap seats. 3 revenue streams, stacked exactly like the decks themselves. That is how you earn back £1.5 million, not in one voyage, in hundreds of them. So the money comes in from 3 directions. Now ask the uncomfortable question, the one the brochure never raises. When this thing goes wrong, who is standing underneath it? Start at the very top. J.P. Morgan's Trust, the International Mercantile Marine, owned the ship on paper, which means the shareholders of that trust owned the downside. When the Titanic went under, a share of the loss landed on people who had never seen her, who held nothing but a certificate in a drawer in New York and a line in a portfolio. But the owner was not carrying the physical ship alone, because no sane operator ever does. Months before she sailed, the hull was insured for £1 million. And here is the detail that shows you how these things really work underneath the word. No single insurer on Earth would swallow a risk that size. It was spread across 12 companies and more than 50 separate Lloyd syndicates, a slice here, a slice there. The Titanic risk on its own came to roughly a fifth of the entire capacity of the Lloyd's market at that time. There's a bitter joke buried in the premium, too. Because the ship was believed to be practically unsinkable, the broker was able to negotiate the cover for a premium of just £7,500. The reputation for safety made the insurance cheap. The market looked at the most famous unsinkable ship in the world and decided the odds were long. That belief saved the owner money right up until the night it cost 1,500 people everything. But strip away the irony and look at what insurance actually is underneath. It is a way of taking one catastrophic risk and shattering it into 100 survivable ones. No single man could afford to be wrong about the Titanic. So the market quietly arranged for 100 men to each be slightly wrong instead. That is not a flaw in the system. That is the system, working precisely as intended. And then there are the risk bearers that nobody insured at all. The 15,000 in Belfast, whose wages depended on the yard staying busy and the orders staying full. The crew, who signed on for a wage that stopped dead the instant the ship stopped. And the 700 souls in steerage, who were carrying the one risk the accountants never wrote down anywhere because they were the ones physically standing on the asset when it met the ice. Everyone in this story is holding a piece of the same risk. But the pieces are not equal, and they do not sit where you would expect. The banker in New York risked money he could comfortably afford to lose. The syndicates risked a slice they had deliberately kept small enough to survive. And the family in steerage risked everything they owned, and everyone they loved, and they were the only ones in the entire structure with no contract, no cap, and no syndicate anywhere spreading their loss. Which brings us to the turn, the thing this whole story has been walking toward from the first sentence. We began by asking who paid for the Titanic, and the reflex is to answer with the build cost. The £1.5 million, the shipyard, the steel, as though the ship were a single purchase, paid for once and then simply owned. But that was never how the money worked. A vessel like this was never meant to pay for herself in one crossing, or 10, or 50. She was a capital asset with a working life measured in decades. Her own sister ship, the Olympic, went on to sail the Atlantic for nearly a quarter of a century. The plan was never earn it back on the maiden voyage. The plan was to put a machine on the water that quietly prints money every week for 25 years, mail check, steerage, suites, and then let the slow arithmetic of time do the rest. So here is the flip. The maiden voyage, the one we have built an entire century of films and books and museum exhibits around, was, in pure financial terms, the least important crossing the Titanic was ever going to make. It was a ribbon cutting, a launch party with a schedule. The real business was all the ordinary, unglamorous, unfilmed Tuesdays that were supposed to come after it, the endlessly repeated crossings that would have slowly turned a pile of Belfast steel into a decades-long river of cash. The Titanic was not expensive because she was luxurious. She was luxurious because luxury was cheap advertising for a machine whose real profit came from volume and from time. And that is exactly why the sinking was such a financial catastrophe. Not because one voyage was lost. One voyage was nothing. It was because the entire future was lost. When she went to the bottom, the trust did not lose a ship. It lost 25 years of Tuesdays. It lost the whole back half of the equation. The long, dull, profitable part where all the real money was always supposed to be. The insurance covered the steel. Nothing covered the future. And nothing at all, anywhere, covered the people, which is the part of the ledger we have been circling all night, and the part we now have to look at directly without the wry voice, because it stops being clever right here. The hull was insured for £1 million, and Lloyd's paid it in full, within 30 days of the sinking. Think about the machinery in that sentence. A ship the size of a cathedral is lying broken at the bottom of the North Atlantic, and inside a single month the paperwork is closed, the money has changed hands, and the asset, as an asset, is whole again. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. That is the quiet horror of it. It didn't fail. It worked. The people did not close in 30 days. More than 1,500 human beings died in that water. The families they left behind filed suit, in Britain and in America, and together they asked for something on the order of $16 million. The company fought them, using an old legal doctrine called limitation of liability, a rule that let a shipowner cap what it owed at the value of what physically remained of the ship. And after the Titanic, what physically remained was a handful of empty lifeboats and a pending insurance claim. 3.5 years later, at the end of 1915, it settled. $664,000, to be divided among all of them. Roughly $500,000 for the American families, around $50,000 for the British, and the remainder swallowed by interest and the cost of the lawyers. Now do the cold arithmetic that the company did. £1 million recovered for the ship, paid inside a month, no argument. $664,000 paid out for 1,500 lives, fought over for 3.5 years. The steel was worth more than the souls, and the entire structure was built, quite deliberately, to make sure it stayed that way. This is the externality. The cost that the beautiful business pushed off its own books and down onto the people with the least power to refuse it. The mail check was contracted. The insurance was contracted. The shareholders were shielded. The syndicates were spread. The one thing in the whole magnificent machine with no contract in its favor, no cap working for it, no one anywhere spreading its loss, was the family in third class, standing on a pier in New York, waiting for a ship that was never going to arrive. So, who paid for the Titanic? On the surface, a New York banker's trust paid to build her, and a long stream of passengers and mail was meant to pay her back. That answer is clean, and it is true as far as it goes. But follow the money all the way to the bottom, and the answer gets a great deal heavier. The men in Belfast paid 8 of them with their lives, before she ever sailed. The emigrants in steerage paid 1 cheap ticket at a time, for a machine whose beauty was aimed at people they would never meet. The Lloyd syndicates paid, quickly and without complaint, to make the steel whole again. And when it all went wrong, the families of the dead paid the last and largest bill of all, the one the system had been specifically engineered to keep small. The Titanic was a brilliant piece of business. And that is not a compliment. That is the whole problem. It worked. The romance was real, and the engineering was real, and the profit was real, and running underneath all 3 of them was a colder truth. That a ship could be insured to the exact pound, while the people aboard her could only ever be settled by negotiation. Next time, we follow the money behind something that didn't just sink a ship. It sank an entire economy. Until then, remember the line, because it outlives the Titanic by a century. The suites were the advertisement, the crossing was the business. And someone is always paying for the part you were never meant to see.